we'd like to welcome you to our Pondside Talk, brought to you by the Wet Plan Program. And if you could move on to the next slide. The Wet Plan Program is brought to you by these partners. I'm Karen Miller. I'll be your moderator today, and I'm with GHD. And then we also have our other partners here with us today from Lee County Natural Resources, Florida Native Plant Society, the Lee County Hyacinth Control District's Pond Watch Program, and Johnson Engineering. Next slide. So we just have a few housekeeping rules. Actually, we've asked you to put your email into the chat feature so that we can invite you to future events if you'd like. And then we also move on to the next slide. Would like to say if you have a question to ask, please unmute yourself and you can ask your question, or you could type it into the chat function and we can read your question for you. So thanks again, everyone, for being here. Today we have Chad Washburn from the Naples Botanical Gardens with us today. Chad is the Vice President of Conservation at Naples Botanical Garden and is responsible for development of the garden's plants conservation strategy and implementation of the program. He leads conservation and natural resources team focusing on conservation projects that ensure the long-term survival of the flora and ecosystems of South Florida and the Caribbean region. He was a part of the team that developed the 2010 and 2021 regional strategies for plant conservation for the Caribbean region. In his role, he serves as a facilitator for gardens across the Greater Caribbean and chair of the American Public Gardens Association International Community. So again, welcome, Chad.
Thank you so much. And I thank you, and my apologies, everybody, for the technical difficulties, and thanks for staying with us. I'd just like to start again by thanking the Wet Plan team for the opportunity to speak to you this morning, and to thank you for taking the time to be here with us. I hope that by the end of this presentation, you've learned some actionable ways that you can contribute to improved water quality in your own communities. And I'd also just like to add again that we're very lucky to have the Wet Plan website as a resource. And I know you looked at that a little bit while we had the technical glitch, but I just want to encourage each of you to familiarize yourself with the website, and that's at wetplan.org. So before we begin, I just want to share again some of the topics that we'll cover in this presentation. We'll discuss why littoral zones are an important component of a healthy functioning stormwater pond. We'll talk a little bit about the establishment and management techniques to give you some background on what are the next steps. And then lastly, we'll cover a plant palette, and that we'll talk about plants that both perform well ecologically, but we also want them to be aesthetically pleasing. So I guess the best place to start is at the beginning. So let's define littoral zone. A littoral zone is the transitional area between upland and open water. So for the purposes of this morning's presentation, we're going to talk about the plantings in this area, but we're also going to include an upland buffer, and that's an area on the upland side of our stormwater ponds. So I'd like to break that littoral zone down into a few different areas and talk about the different types of plants that you'll find in each. So the first part is the emergent zone. That's from about here to about here. And this is plants that are growing rooted in water, and it can range from inundated to flooded, depending on the fluctuating water levels. And the plants here perform a really important function, but they also help to cover what I call ring around the tub. That's not a scientific term, but when you see an image later on in the presentation, you'll understand what I mean by that ring around the tub. The next part is the transitional zone. And this is plants that are growing rooted in water and into the uplands. So it really just depends on the fluctuating water levels, but these are mostly just rooted in water, but growing above the water. And the last zone is the upland buffer. And this would be plants that are growing outside of the littoral zone on the upland side, but they perform just as important of an ecological function as the rest of the littoral zone. So I just used the term ecological function. What does that mean? Well, ecological functions are the ways, in this instance, are the ways that healthy littoral plantings work to improve the efficiency of our stormwater system for removing pollutants, but also how they act together as an ecosystem. So I'll share some examples on my screen of some of the functions and values of littoral plantings. And we'll go through each of these as we continue on through the presentation. And I've got examples for each. So littorals, especially those emergent plants, that lower section that's in the water, that's inundated to flooded, they can provide habitat for aquatic invertebrates and small fish. And that's a part of any healthy ecosystem. You have multiple layers. Contributing to healthy fish populations and providing food for wading birds. Fish actually can help to, a native population of fish can actually help your pond be more stable and be more efficient at removing pollutants. And there's actually a professor at FGCU who works towards managing ponds for stormwater efficiency by having healthy fish populations. So this picture is actually taken at the Botanical Garden, and our birding tours at the garden really focus on the littoral areas as around our ponds. It's one of the best places to see birds. Here we go, ring around the tub. This is what I mean when I say ring around the tub. So littoral plantings can also drastically alter the look of a stormwater pond, and they can help to increase property values, especially in a situation like this one. I took this picture earlier on in the summer, and it's a pond here in Naples, and it's what many of our ponds look like, and this may be what yours looks like during the dry season before the rains really begin. I call this ring around the tub, but in many cases, littoral plants can help to hide this, those banks, those muddy banks in low water situations. This pond in particular can be quite a challenge because there's quite a bit of elevation change here, but having some littoral plantings in there would definitely help to hide this. One thing I will note that in a pond like this, you can see, even with the water levels low, during the dry season, they have this fountain. As evaporation occurs during the dry season, spraying the water into the air actually exacerbates the problem of evaporation. So in this instance, I would recommend turning the fountain off. It's making this worse. Littorals can also help to control erosion and help to stabilize our shorelines. And we see this in many of our ponds where the shoreline is not stable, and you get what we have here, the shoreline just kind of sloughing off into the stormwater pond. This is really sometimes a consideration when grass carp have been used in the ponds to control algae. It can be difficult to establish plants in an area where there are grass carp, and sometimes you'll get fish that are nesting along the edges here, and that makes the problem worse. Littoral plants can help in this instance, both by holding the soil, the roots hold the soil along the shoreline in place so that it doesn't slough off and erode into the pond, but it also helps buffer wave action. So on a windy day, like many of you might have today, waves inside the pond actually can erode away at the edges of the ponds as well. So that littoral zone helps to prevent erosion coming from water on land, but also erosion from inside the pond. So this is embarrassingly enough, this is in my own community. This is the stormwater pond in my community. We have grass right down to the edge. So both a littoral planting zone and an upland buffer would act as a buffer between what happens on the upland side and the open water. In this instance, a buffer planting on the upland side of the littoral zone prevents turf grass clippings and leaf litter from going into the pond. When you mow or your company mows along the pond, grass clippings and other organic matter quite often in this instance end up in the pond, and they're a major pollutant in our stormwater ponds. Actually, grass clippings like this can contribute to algal blooms and cause major management issues in your pond. As grass clippings and leaf litter gets into the pond, it decomposes, it removes oxygen from the water column, and under those low oxygen conditions, phosphorus that's bound to the sediments gets released back into the water column. So from something like grass clippings going in, we can have a phosphorus bomb, internal phosphorus loading in the water column, and suddenly have an algal bloom. So that littoral zone and buffer zone are really important. So littorals also impact nutrient and pollution and sedimentation in ponds by slowing the movement of water. Slowing water down causes sediments to settle out, especially in areas if you've got any ditches or conveyances. If they've got plantings in them, that really helps to slow the water down. Again, slow water, the pollutants, especially the particulates, will settle out. Plants also help to uptake pollutants, especially nutrients within a pond. So in a situation where you have higher nutrients in the pond, the plants are going to help also by taking those up. So all of these functions that we've talked about are vital to a healthy functioning stormwater pond. And to explain why pollutants is removing pollutants is so important, I want to take a look at one nutrient in particular for just a moment. We're going to focus on phosphorus. Florida soils often naturally contain phosphorus in them. It's a part of our soil structure. So we're not going to focus on that phosphorus that's naturally in our soils. For this presentation, we're going to focus on anthropogenic phosphorus, or the phosphorus that we put on our landscapes through fertilizer. Phosphorus is the major limiting nutrient in most freshwater systems, and just a small amount can cause significant damage to the health and function of a stormwater pond. There really does not take much total phosphorus in the water column to significantly alter the growth of algae in fresh water. So on this side, we've got what would be an oligotrophic pond. And that would be a pond that is really, the water's really clear, very low in nutrients. There's an abundance of dissolved oxygen in the water column. That's about 0.005 parts per million total phosphorus in the water column. A very minor shift to 0.01 parts per million total phosphorus in the water column, and you get what's called eutrophication. And that's a body of water that's really rich in nutrients. It supports a dense population of plants and typically algae. And when that explosion of that growth of algae occurs, it eventually dies and removes oxygen from the water column. We get fish kills. We get some of the toxic conditions that we hear with toxic algal blooms. So I know those are some big terms, oligotrophic and eutrophic, but we can show that, we can visualize that in just this one particular photograph. This photograph always amazes and shocks me. This would be an oligotrophic pond, and this would be a eutrophic. This bright green is an algal bloom. This is algae growing, an explosive growth of algae in this pond. This photo is from a project called the Experimental Lakes Area. And this was a project near Ontario, Canada. And they used these thousands of lakes to experimentally determine nutrient cycling in lakes and what different nutrients do. We didn't really have a good understanding up to this point what they did. So they added phosphorus to one side of this lake, and they've got this column separating the two parts of this lake. And just by adding phosphorus, we had this explosive growth of algae. So seeing this in the 70s, I thought, wow, this is really strong. This is a really powerful image. Adding phosphorus, we get algal growth. But how can I do that as a scientist? I'm curious. I want to see this for myself. So I didn't want to do this to our pond here at the garden, but to recreate this, I actually took a pitcher of stormwater from our stormwater pond. I mixed it up really well with a spoon, and then I poured it that mixed water into these 2 sample bottles. And I put just a couple, I think 2 or 3 tiny little grains of liquid fertilizer, the stuff that melts down. I put that into one of these bottles, and I think you can guess which one. After about 2 weeks, we had this algal bloom in this one on the right side of your screen. That's from just a couple little grains of fertilizer that caused this algal bloom. So I don't recommend doing this at home with this algal bloom. I don't know what type of algae was in this, if it was anything that could have been toxic. So, but a small amount of phosphorus, it does show, causes this bloom. So now that we've discussed some of the important functions of littoral plantings, let's take a quick look at establishing and maintaining healthy littoral plantings in your pond, in your own community. What are some of the things that we need to do to make this happen, to go the next step? First off, collaboration is key. There are a lot of stakeholders in your community. There's the homeowners, there's the landscape managers, community association managers, and quite often, if you have a pond manager and a landscape management company, the 2 are independent companies and they manage both areas, but they don't often communicate. So bringing everybody to the table and having a conversation around what you really want out of your stormwater ponds. One of the things that you can do is discuss limiting phosphorus-based fertilizers in your community. Know your pond's seasonal changes. Before anybody goes out and does plantings around your own ponds, know some of the key factors about each of the ponds in your community. This includes some of the potential fluctuations in salinity, fluctuations in water level. Each pond, even within their own community, are going to be a little bit different throughout the year. Some may fluctuate more than others. Each pond has its own parameters, and they should be looked at, planted, and managed individually. Select appropriate plants. Select the plants based on the areas that you're planting. Salinity. If you have one pond that is more saline than the others or more brackish, you want to select a different plant palette, something that can take that salt water. You want to maximize long-term performance over plants that go dormant. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we cover the plant list. Plant only natives. Avoid non-native and exotic plants because they can become invasive in aquatic systems. Plant at the appropriate times. The best time to plant a stormwater pond is really just at the beginning of the rainy season. You'll get that stormwater or that influx of water. The plants are coming out of a nursery. They're coming from a situation where they're not flooded. And if you plant them into deep water, you'll lose some of those plants. They'll die. That's a quick change from a nursery setting to deep water. So if you plant them on the higher side, they'll grow into their situation. You also need to water less. As I mentioned, plant them on the higher side. If something grows in 2 foot of water, if you plant it in 6 inches of water, you'll have greater success at establishment, but it'll also grow in. And I've taken several pictures of our ponds over the years. And as the water level goes up and down in our stormwater ponds, those littoral zones actually fluctuate where those plants are growing. Establish a trial area to see what works and what doesn't in each of your ponds. Design it to keep green waste and grass clippings out of the water. This means adding a wide buffer zone on the upland side in any area that you can. Be careful though, don't block views for homeowners. That's something that homeowners really stress. They want to be able to see the water. That's really important. Keep the view sheds open. Avoid grass carp. Last recommendation, grass carp in ponds tend to, when you plant littoral plants, they tend to eat those plants very quickly, and that can get very expensive. So I know that's one thing that people do use. And in situations where you have explosive algal growth, it may be something that you need to include in the pond, and then over time remove them so that you can establish littoral plants. So establishment of the plants is the first step, but from there, once we get them established in our stormwater ponds, we need to maintain them over time. It's not something that we can just walk away from and we've created an ecosystem. They need a little bit of management. So what do we do to manage those and maintain those littoral zones? Again, collaboration is key. I saw in the chat, somebody mentioned, yes, collaborate. Collaborate with the community. Make sure that expectations are managed, what this will look like, that landscape practices both on the upland side and in the ponds match well so that we don't have heavy phosphorus use on the upland side. When we get heavy phosphorus use or fertilizer use, we get explosive growth of algae, but we also get explosive growth of invasive species, cattails, torpedo grass. You get explosive growth of those invasives, and then suddenly you have to treat using an herbicide when you get those things. If you do have to use herbicide, use the appropriate herbicide and always follow the labels. There are herbicides used that are labeled for aquatic use. Make sure that your land manager is using the appropriate ones and using them as sparingly as possible. Do not unnecessarily renewal cut the grasses. At our stormwater ponds, we have the upland buffer of some of the native grasses that are also used as ornamentals. And one thing we see in the landscape is quite often landscapers will cut them back at the end of the year and you get these little teepee shaped things. You don't necessarily have to do that. If you do that, you open up light gaps and you get weeds that'll begin to grow in your littoral areas. If you do have to renewal cut some of those grasses, use the grass that's cut off as a mulch, and that'll help prevent those weeds from germinating. And the last recommendation is to manage adaptively. Ponds change over time. If you plant your pond now, in 10 years, the conditions in your pond will change over time. It changes as drainage changes, as more impervious surfaces in your community. Ponds are a living system. So over time, you're gonna have to manage them adaptively and kind of change your management strategy to suit the conditions of your pond. Next, the part that everybody's always interested in, the planting side of things. And I will say this, I'll go through each of these, but the plants, having a plant list is not enough. All of the other things, that management is important, that establishment phase is important. So the plant list is one thing that's important, but as we go through, I'll discuss some of these, and I'll talk about why it may be a good plant and why it may not be a good plant for your system. We'll start on the upland side and we'll work our way down towards the emergent side. So for buffers and some of the getting down towards the emergent side, Fakahatchee grass is a great plant. It likes moist soils. This is something that you would plant in masses. This one, however, you'll see here I give both a common name and the scientific name. We do that because sometimes common names are used interchangeably. Sometimes we have the same common name, can be a couple different species. So Tripscum dactyloides or Fakahatchee grass. This can plant it in mass in your buffer zones. One caution with this plant is it can grow quite large. It can be typically 3 to 4 foot tall. But when it's in bloom, you'll see this one is in bloom here. These flower spikes can stick up as high as 5, even sometimes 6 feet. So this is one I wouldn't plant it in an area where it can block a view shed. This is a great one for along golf courses or buffer zones to natural areas. There is another plant, much like this one, the dwarf Fakahatchee grass or Tripsicum floridanum. One of the other names that you'll hear for this is Half-a-Hatchee grass, which I always think is quite funny. This is another one that I would plant on the upland banks and in the buffers. It's much shorter than Fakahatchee grass. It grows to about 2 to 3 feet, and the flower spikes can get up to about 4 foot tall, but they really don't block the view. The flowers are really sparse. This is a really highly drought tolerant plant. It likes having moist soils, but if we get dry conditions, it survives beautifully. So this is, again, one that I would plant in masses around the buffer zones of your stormwater pond. This is also used as an ornamental grass around the area. Sand cordgrass, or Spartina bakeri. This is another one to plant mixed in or in masses in your upland buffer. If you want to do a more naturalistic look, you can mix these grasses. If you want to do a more formal look, plant them in large masses of the same species together. This gets about 3 foot in height and about 4 to 5 foot wide, and that's great. You can plant these as a smaller plant and let them grow in. If you do that, you want to manage weeds in between them until they're established. When this clump of grass grows and it's 4 to 5 feet wide, and they really grow into each other, that really prevents weeds from germinating. It prevents light gaps. And that helps to cut down on any herbicide use, helps to really cut down on your maintenance needs. This one, again, likes moist soils, but it is tolerant of drought. Marsh hay cordgrass, this is Spartina patens. This is much like it's related to the sand cordgrass, but this one is not a clumper, it's a runner. It spreads by rhizomes. I would plant this one a little bit lower than the others on the bank. It's a great one for that transitional zone, getting into the water. It can tolerate some drought, but it likes more wet feet. And this one grows 2 to 3 feet, and it spreads, as I said. This makes a beautiful green zone around your pond. This one is one of my favorites. If you drive across Tamiami Trail, especially in the fall, you'll see this in bloom. You see masses of this in bloom. And this year, here, especially in Cuyahoga County, we've seen this used as a landscape plant in our medians. It does bloom periodically throughout the year, but in the summer, you'll see blooms periodically. But in those winter months, it really is fantastic. This is a solid performer. It does really well, ornamental. It's pink muley grass. But with this one throughout the year, sometimes it can look a little bit messy when it's not in bloom. One of the things that we do here at the garden is we'll plant our other grasses and mix in 20% pink muley grass along with it. That way, in those areas where you just have grasses, you get this nice flush of color throughout areas of the year. This does reseed and it will respread. And I have to say, over the last couple of years, there are some great new cultivars of this pink muley grass. I have not trialed them, but that's one thing we hope to do this year, that are a little bit more formal looking. And they don't, throughout the year, they look a little better. When this one finishes blooming, it can get a little bit ragged looking. Another plant that is not a grass that can work in these buffer zones or really closer to the water's edge are leather ferns. And there are 2 native leather ferns. The more attractive of those 2 is the golden leather fern, or Acrosticum aureum. It's not as tall. It does not spread as much. It's a little more controlled than the Everglades leather fern. But this grows in that transitional area, maybe just below where those buffer grasses are. It likes to have wet feet, although I've seen them grown in the landscape as a landscape plant. This one grows about 4 feet high, so it's 4 to 5 feet high. It's one you don't want to plant necessarily right in front of someone's view shed. This grows as a clump, and this is something that I would plant as an accent to help break up that look of just some of those grasses around the outside edge. Now moving down into the water column, there really are 2 great plants that I would recommend planting together. They look very similar, but you get a little bit more diversity when you plant these 2. One is Gulf Coast Spike Rush, and this grows in wide bands around the littoral zones. And this is the one that helps to really cover that ring around the tub. This is one that, as we see water levels fluctuate at the garden, we see this one move up and down kind of its growth zone kind of move up and down the banks throughout the year. The other one is knotted spike rush, and that's Eleocris cellulosa. Again, plant these two species, even though they look almost exactly the same and it's difficult to tell them apart. I like to plant them together because you get, by having biodiversity, you have a little bit of insurance. If you get a little bit more brackish water one year, one will survive better than the other. Since they're different species, they have slightly different tolerances. So diversity is important. So moving outside of some of those grass-looking plants, grass and rush-looking plants, we have duck potato or Sagittaria latifolia. These should be used as accent plants. These are something that I would plant in clumps. They can provide some color and some different forms. They have, this one in particular has broad tropical looking leaves, and it also has attractive white flowers throughout the year. So to get that visual impact, plant them in clumps or masses. They will spread. They're not going to take over an area very readily. Sometimes they will in just the right conditions. But this is a great one. It grows 2 to 3 feet tall, and it likes organic soils. So if you have a pond, an older pond, they'll do quite well in those organic soils that have developed over time in your pond. A relative of that is lance-leafed arrowhead, Sagittaria lancifolia. This again gets attractive white flowers with yellow centers. This gets about 2 to 3 foot tall. And again, I would plant this one in clumps or in masses to get that visual effect. This is a favorite, swamp lily. And I just drove across the Everglades a couple days ago, and you could see this dotting the landscape. Once they flower, they get these beautiful white flowers that are about 6 inches across for each flower, 4 to 6 inches across. But these are best planted scattered throughout the emergent areas. Some of the others we recommend clumping, but there is a lubber grasshopper that eats the leaves of this plant. So if you plant them in masses, you're going to get those lubbers coming in and defoliating them. So if you just plant bulbs of this in various areas throughout the littoral zone, throughout the wet areas, you'll get these pops of color throughout the year. This is a great one to include. And if you do have this in your pond, I do highly recommend. They're incredibly fragrant. They're intensely fragrant. They're really nice to smell. Another one is the iris, southern iris or Iris hexagona. Much like the swamp lily, these are something that's rarely seen until they're in bloom. These form small clumps, and I would plant them in masses. They make great accents in some of your emergent ponds or emergent plantings. And these will bloom in the spring. These blooms when typically our snowbird population is here. That's something we really want. We want this to be attractive when the snowbirds are here. That's why at the end, I'll talk about a few plants that I don't recommend. I see them on every plant list, but I don't recommend because they're not attractive when people are here. If you want this to your littoral zone to be attractive, this is one I'd highly recommend. So I also want to highlight a few trees to plant. This is something, I wouldn't plant trees in an area that's going to block view sheds, but trees can be really important in your design. You want to include trees in areas where you break up that horizontal view on the shoreline. Gives you some vertical elements. Again, you can do this in a way that is very attractive. We're a world-class botanical garden, and we have stormwater ponds and stormwater areas as some of our most visual features and most prominent features on our site. So buttonwood, we often think of this as something that grows in the mangroves, but they're actually used as street trees in areas around the world. They take significant amount of drought, but they'll also take flooding. They're very attractive, and they can be maintained as shrubs if you'd like in the landscape. But here in this situation, let them grow as trees. They have beautiful gnarled bark on them, and they're actually a great host for epiphytes, for bromeliads, for orchids. Another one is bald cypress. This will take inundated to flooded conditions. And this helps, again, to break up that shoreline visually. Keep in mind that they're called bald cypress for a reason. They do go dormant during the winter months when our snowbirds are here. That's where the name bald cypress. They're bald for a portion of the year. They do have a very attractive structure though during the winter months. So I will say that, but keep in mind that they will go dormant. Dahoon holly, this is one that we see, Ilex cassine, we see this in our landscapes. This is used as a street tree around Southwest Florida, but they're a swamp tree. They like moist organic soils, so they'll actually do better in a littoral pond planting around your pond. They are a tree that can be male or female. So if you want one that's got fruits, has these bright red fruits, you have to plant a female. If you go to a nursery that has some more mature plants, quite often you can find out which ones are male or female. Those fruits can range from red to orange to yellow, depending on genetics of the individual plants. Another one is red maple. This is one that provides some color. We use that in a few areas, especially when you've got a long view across the lake. Because you get that reflection of them on the water. I do want to say that this has a short lifespan. It's a soft-wooded tree, and it lives 15 to 20 years. So this is one you're going to get some attractive color, especially in the spring and fall when you get this red growth. But it is one that after about 20 years, you're going to have to replace. Another one, Sweet Bay Magnolia. This is a fantastic tree, has really silvery foliage. They're native. This is Sweet Bay Magnolia. This is different than the one that you see as street plantings in Florida. This one has that attractive silver foliage, but you get these beautiful white flowers that are about 4 inches across. And it flowers in the spring and summer. So that's the last tree and the last recommended plant I want to cover. Before we get to questions, I just want to point out a few plants that I would avoid. They're on every species list for ponds, but I highly recommend avoiding them. One of them is pickerel weed. This is native. It is a beautiful flowering plant, but I would avoid it or use it sparingly. Quite often these go dormant throughout the winter months. So you have an area, we actually planted 3,000 of them along a pond edge when I moved here to Naples, and none of them came back in year 2. They're also highly variable genetically from depending on where they were sourced for the nursery. So something that does well in Lee County may not do well in Collier County. We have slightly different conditions, temperature-wise. These are really highly variable. This is one, if you plant, I would use it very sparingly. Alligator flag, or Thalia geniculata. This one goes dormant. It's this big, beautiful, tropical-looking plant with these broad leaves, but they go dormant during the winter months. So you have this brown-looking plant that spreads really quickly and then goes dormant. So it looks dead when all of our visitors are here. It also gets a caterpillar that can eat the leaves. Caterpillars are good. They're food for birds. They grow into pollinators. But on this plant, when you have these big, beautiful leaves, quite often you'll see quite a bit of damage to the leaves of this one. Yellow canna, again, this is another one that goes dormant. It spreads really well, but you get these big brown dead patches throughout the year when our snowbirds are here. And the last one that I would recommend avoiding is giant bulrush. These are the Shenoplectus species. They're Shenoplectus californicus, and I think the other one is Americanus. These get 7 to 9 foot tall. Definitely something that you don't want to plant in front of a homeowner's view shed into their pond. These will take over and they won't be able to see the pond. So again, I would highly recommend avoiding this one. Even though you'll see it on some species list as a recommended native plant, it's one that I would avoid. So with that, I can stop here, and I think we have some time yet for questions. So let me stop sharing my screen.
Yes, we do have time for questions. You know, there was one issue that came up in the chat that I thought maybe you and our teammates could address. And Peggy Hall was looking for recommendations for commercial providers to take care of ponds. Wet Plan doesn't make those kind of recommendations, but we could talk a little bit about what do you ask your provider to make sure that they're using best management practices. If you want to weigh in on that, that'd be great.
Okay, sure. The That's good. It's interesting. I see Cesar Peralta in the he's here in the presentation. Hi, Cesar. So he teaches some great classes here in Collier County. We have the Greenscape certification, here, I don't know about Lee County what the requirements are for that, but having that certification, that means that the company has gone through a training understanding what phosphorus and fertilizers and nutrients do. It really promotes best practices. Ask them what they do for best practices. Do they follow best practices for establishment, for management of not only the pond side of things, but the upland side of things. Make sure that they follow all of the laws and rules for nutrient use. I won't say what those are because I think everybody in this presentation are going to have a little bit different rules depending on where you're located. I know here in Collier County, we have different areas with different rules. So I'm trying to think of anything else that I can add to that. Cesar, is there anything that you would like to add?
Well, like I said, it's very important that you hire people that are being trained. And unfortunately, in the governments of Collier County and the city of Naples don't really require that a landscaper is trained. But that doesn't mean an association can't stop, can be stopped from doing that. So the more educated your landscapers are, the better. In Lee County and the city of Marco Island, there's a requirement in Lee County that anybody who's going to register a landscaping company, at least one person must be certified. But the problem with that is that you have companies that have 50, 100 people and only one person certified. I like more how Marco Island does it, that they require that at least one person on that crew be GIB certified, so they clearly understand what are the consequences of misapplying nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers, near the water bodies and all of that. So again, the governments or the local governments may be soft about this thing, but what I would do as an association is that I would be more stricter than the local governments and require this. So at least we know that they have been through a training. And even the associations, if you just take the course to know what is it that we teach the local landscapers, and then then by knowing what they have to know, then you'll be able to ask the right question.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, Maria Romero, did you want to weigh in on that at all?
Like Cesar already said, we don't have very strict regulations for pond maintenance companies. But yeah, like Cesar said, like that's something that the community, can look into it before hiring them.
Great, thank you. So do we have any other questions out there? If you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself.
I
ask.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I have one question. I wasn't clear when the best time was to plant littorals.
Okay. The best time to plant littorals is in the spring, just before the spring rain season starts, as the water levels come up. That way you don't have to, they're going into a growing season, so they're going to enter a period of very active growth and have all summer to be established. That way you're also not providing supplemental watering. That way also you can plant plants on the higher side when the water levels are low, and as the water levels come up, remember those plants are coming out of a nursery where they're typically just getting irrigation. If you plant them underwater, it's going to drown them out. They can grow in that zone, but that transition from a nursery setting to deep water is not beneficial to the plants. So plant in the spring and a little bit on the higher side from where the plants should be, especially on the aquatic side.
Thank you. And one more question. The plant to avoid was alligator. I didn't get the second word.
Alligator flag. And they call it alligator flag because it grows dense, and when alligators move through it, it kind of waves and you can see where the alligators are. I don't know how necessarily true that is, but that's, I think, how it got its name.
Thank you.
Hey, Chad, Janine has a couple questions. So one, can you discuss the importance of turf management?
Yeah, absolutely. I would highly recommend not having turf right down to the edge of the water's edge in your community. There's so much potential for getting organic matter in your pond or getting nutrients in your pond. Quite often there's no visual delineation there for a landscaper to stop. There's a buffer zone where you cannot put fertilizer down around that pond. But without that visual buffer, you lose where that delineation is. So on turf, I would highly recommend, if you have that buffer zone, it prevents grass clippings from going into the water. Make sure you're in your own home and in your landscape, you're fertilizing appropriately. If you are using fertilizer, use very low to zero fertilizer or phosphorus. Use slow release nitrogen. Make sure that you have 50% or more slow release nitrogen, depending on the requirements and the laws in your local community. Managing the turf appropriately using best practices is one really big way in your community to prevent runoff into your ponds. Don't overwater your turf grass. Quite often, if it's over-fertilized and overwatered, you've got to spray for pests, and that's another pollutant that can enter your stormwater ponds.
We have actually we have a lot of weeds around. We don't have much of a turf in many areas, and so we have a lot of weeding areas. And I just was curious about like the density of the turf and the value of that. Because I don't think you want to kill the weeds. I think you need to, because I don't want that running off into our ponds.
No, it's better to have something growing there. You know, if you just have weeds, you know, if it's just weeds, I mean, it's a great, I would not kill, and you know, I would not ever have bare soil. I'll say that. If you have weeds, it's a great opportunity. I know the Lobo chapter of the Native Plant Society helped to sponsor this. I highly recommend you know, planting that area with native plants. But if you don't do anything, don't spray those weeds and leave bare soil for sure.
So we're a little over time, but I think we could take another 4 or 5 minutes if that's all right with you, Chad, since we had some technical difficulties there. Okay,
yeah.
great.
Yeah.
So Janine also asked, is phosphorus the most damaging nutrient?
Yes and no. So in freshwater conditions, phosphorus is often your most limiting nutrient. As you get into brackish conditions, brackish and saltwater, nitrogen is really damaging to more brackish and saltwater areas. So it's really important to remember that your stormwater pond is just the first part of water treatment. That water then goes quite often, eventually, if it makes its way into the Gulf, that's where it's going to go. So we need to be really careful of all of the nutrients, all of the nutrient use in our homes and in our communities. So phosphorus is really key in our stormwater ponds, but I don't want to say that it's the only thing that we need to be concerned about.
And Peggy Hall asks, is there value to floating vegetation islands in addition to littoral plantings?
I'm sorry, that one froze and I didn't hear it, but I see Peggy's question in the chat. Is there value to floating vegetation islands in addition to littoral plantings? There is. My lights just went off. The floating islands, they do add some benefit, planted with native plants. They do add some benefit. They do take maintenance. It's something that you may have to pull in and replant every few years as those plants grow and senesce over time. There's some consideration that might provide a refugia for aquatic invertebrates that help to consume algae. There's some consideration. I know that there was one study looking into effect of the roots in preventing algal growth. I won't get into that, but yeah, I think that they can be very beneficial. And the more that you do towards a stormwater pond, the more comprehensive approach you take, the more success that you'll have. I'll say that.
Yeah, and then Brian asks, are there any laws that require having plants around ponds?
That's a good question, and that's going to depend on where you live. The laws are different between Lee County and Collier County. I know here in Collier County, you have to have a certain percentage of coverage of littoral plants around your pond. You have to have a certain percentage or a certain number of different species. You can't plant with just one species. So I don't know what the law is like in Lee County or where anybody is joining us from, but look to your own laws in your own community. I have to tell you, if you reach out to here in Collier County, it's the pollution control. If you reach out to them and ask, they will be more than happy to provide you with what the laws are and recommendations. They want to see people be more proactive. Clean water impacts all of us. Really impacts the environment is our economy.
Maybe I'm going to ask Andy Tilton to weigh in on that. Andy, we had a question about, is there laws about plantings around ponds? Is that relying on your permits sometimes?
For the most part, it's related to the permits issued either by, generally it's at the county or city level, but sometimes required also by the water management district in the permits. So that's the first place to look. Beyond that, there's not a lot of legal requirements for them, but it's very open allowance that if you want to have an improvement in your community, make the pond function more like a lake, even though it is a treatment system. It's a great way to improve water quality, as well as Chad mentioned, slow up erosion problems, as we discussed last month. And I was just going to also add back to last month's comments about erosion. If you're going to create a buffer zone, which means taking out whatever is there, the turf or whatever is there now, to not have erosion between the newly planted plants and not have the bare soil, as Chad mentioned, you may want to look at some sort of a low-end geofabric to cover that soil in the interim period.
Great,
And
thanks, Andy.
I just want to say, Maria just dropped in the chat the fertilizer calculator that's for Lee County. That's a fantastic resource, and I highly recommend checking that out. That's Maria put that in the chat, that link. So.
Yeah, and Caesar put some good information in there too, so pay attention to the chat. And we probably have time for just one more question, if anyone has one. And if not, I think we could probably close out, and we want to thank everyone. Chad, thank you so much for this presentation. It was really informative. I'm sure everyone really is thankful for all the information you've given us.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. And we just want to say our next Pondside Talk will be on January 6th, same time, same channel. So check out our website, www.wetplan.org. for that information. And we really want to thank everyone for joining us and participating. And we're sorry about the technical difficulties, but we worked through it pretty well. So I think it worked out great. Thanks, everyone. Have a
Thanks.
great day.